Drawing a cozy cartoon version of yourself is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools, and let's get started. So as usual, we're going to start by drawing a rough sketch of our character in the scene, but first we might want to set up the file. So no matter which canvas you're using, if you are working in Procreate and if you want to have my illustration as a reference here, you can do that by going in the wrench icon menu here at the top, in the canvas submenu, and then activating the reference toggle, which is going to let you import a picture. So if you want to download my illustration as a reference along with the color palette that I'm going to use in this video, they will both be linked in the description below and they're totally free. That being said, this is a cartoon yourself, so this color palette is made for me. You're probably going to need a different one, but I'm going to show you how to build it. Speaking of which, you might want to import a picture of yourself or whoever else you're drawing as this character here, so we can use it as a reference for the hair and for the colors as well. So it doesn't need to be a picture of yourself that you necessarily like, just something that you know you can use for the colors. Now if you're working in Procreate, the way to import a picture is just to go through the wrench icon menu once more, and then in the add submenu this time, selecting insert a photo, which is going to open up your camera roll, and from there you just have to locate the picture, tap on it, and it's going to place it in your file. Once you have your picture, go ahead and put it in one of the corners, it doesn't matter which one, but make sure that the picture is quite small so we have plenty of room to draw around it. So like I was saying, we're going to start with just a rough sketch to map out the composition, so go ahead and create a new layer in your layer panel and rename it to Sketch. Now for sketching, you can pick whatever color you know you like sketching with. I personally just usually pick a neutral gray, but feel free to go with whatever you want because we're not going to see the sketch in the final result, so it really doesn't matter. And in this video, I'm always going to be suggesting a few different kind of brushes that you could use to follow along. I'm going to suggest free brushes that come with Procreate and work totally fine. I'm going to give you tips on finding brush alternatives if you're not working in Procreate, and I'm also going to suggest brushes from my Ultimate Illustration bundle. Now these brushes, don't worry, they're really not essential, you can totally follow along without them, but they are brushes that are there to help you save time and get more professional results if you want, because they're really sensitive to the Apple Pencil and they can help you get better texture and better control overall than the free brushes that come with Procreate. So if you do want to check them out, again, it's really not essential, there will be a link in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. That being said, just like for the color, the brush that you use for your sketch really doesn't matter because we're not going to see it in the final result, so just pick something you know you're comfortable with. A few options could be, for example, if you're working with the free brushes in Procreate, in the sketching pack, where is it? There we go, the HB pencil. If you're working in a different software, something that has pencil in the name is probably going to be your best bet. But if you have the illustration bundle, go ahead and pick the sketching brush. So we're going to start by just quickly mapping out the room, mostly the little windowsill area. And here the composition is totally up to you. So your character could be on the floor. If you want to draw your character in your own room, you could do that. It could be on the couch, it could be on the beanbag, whatever you want. So really here the idea is to draw the bones of the room. And then once you have the main kind of structure of the room, it's pretty much just a game of decorating it and then putting your character in it. Now for that, it might be helpful to hide your reference picture just so you can see the whole composition. And then without drawing your character very clearly, I'm going to show you how to do that in the next step. Just roughly map out with an egg shape or something like that where you want it to be, just so you get an idea of what is going to be left around your character and where you could put some decorations. Here the main idea is to draw decorations that make you happy and that feel like you. So what that means for me is a lot of plants and a lot of sunlight, but it could be totally different for you. So feel free to look around and see what around you inspires you, makes you happy. You can also look at home decor inspiration on Pinterest if you're not exactly sure. And then you can quickly go ahead and just figure out where you're going to place the elements. So without having to draw them very precisely, just mapping out where everything is going to be. For example, I know I want to have a big plant in this bottom corner, otherwise I feel like it's super empty. So I'm going to sketch a pot and then some just big leaves so that I know it's going to be a big plant and not just something tiny on the floor. Similarly to this wall I feel would be very empty. So what could I add? Maybe a big pillow behind my character. Maybe I could have some artwork, like pictures and stuff. But in my case, again, if it was real life, I know I would just add a plant there, so that's what I'm going to do in this illustration as well. But maybe more vining plants here. So again, just very quickly showing the idea of a vining plant. Then this window I really like, but I feel like it's a bit boring if it's just the window itself and then the frame. So maybe adding some curtains. Maybe I want to add another plant in this corner here so that I have 3, which is an odd number, and that just looks better overall. Maybe I can add a few more pillows. And maybe I'm going to be sitting on a blanket or something. So as you can see at this stage, we're still totally just in the exploration phase. We're just trying to decorate and see what we could do with this piece. And there's nothing that says you need to be happy with your first sketch. You could totally go ahead and just hide this layer and just start over again with new layers until you have something that feels like it's wanting to be pushed a bit further into a cleaner sketch. So take all the time you need here to experiment with just creating a rough version of your piece. And once you're happy with it, we're going to meet up in the next step, which is going to be all about refining this crazy looking mess and turning it into a sketch that we can then use for the colors. So there are a few different methods you could use to refine this crazy looking sketch. You could go in with your eraser and kind of try to clean it up as is on that layer. That's not the way I personally like to do it, but that's totally a valid way if that's the way you know you like to clean up sketch. I prefer to go back and lower the opacity of that sketch layer, and then just start over on a fresh, brand new layer that I usually rename to Clean Sketch. And here the main thing we have to do clearly is sketching our character, because right now we just have this egg shape, and then just building a slightly cleaner, more precise environment around the character. So zooming in on the space that you kept for your character, so your egg shape, we're going to break it down in super simple shapes still, but that connect more with the character than just an oval like this. So you can start with some sort of bean shape like this, which is going to be the body of the character. And then on top of that, a circle for the head. Now from there you can draw the legs in whichever position you want. You could just draw them very straight, but I want my character to look extra cozy, so I'm going to have the legs bent. And one super easy way to do that is to break down the legs in 3 ovals. One big oval for the thigh, slightly thinner one but still as long oval for the shin, and then a smaller oval for the feet. And we're also going to use the exact same technique for the arms, but before that it might be helpful to just sketch any object that your character might be holding. In my case I'm going to be holding a book, but you could be holding a teacup, a handheld, video game, console, seriously whatever you want to hold, but just kind of sketching it first so that you know how to connect your arms. If you're sketching a book, a really easy way to do it is to just start with the V shape at the top and then just adding 2 vertical lines on the side. And I know I renamed this layer to Clean Sketch, but we're still kind of in a rough sketch phase, at least for the character, so if at any point you notice that something doesn't look right, you have a few options to course correct as you go. One of them could be using the selection tool here at the top, setting it to freehand, and then selecting one basic shape that it is, in fact, a body part, but for now are still very basic shape, which means they're easy to move. But just selecting one of those, and then using the arrow tool, you could just resize it if you feel like it needs to be resized. You could rotate it or just reposition it. You can also course correct by just sketching more lines. For example, I find like my back here is a little bit too intense, so I'm just going to move my line. Now for the arms, before drawing the ovals, I find it to be helpful to just map out where they're going to connect with the body, so essentially the shoulder socket, and then from there going in and drawing the top of the arm and then the forearm. Now for the head and facial features, the first thing I like to do is map out my vertical and horizontal middle lines, so what I call the plus sign, just to see the direction of the head. And from there it's pretty easy to place the different facial features, for example, the nose, the eyes, the mouth. I like to have pretty big round ears on my characters. And I also like to refine the shape of the head, so instead of having it be a circle, I usually like to have it be more of a bean shape, so just kind of extending the cheek on the side like this. Now to draw the hair, this is where it could be helpful for you to reactivate your reference picture and use it not to draw exactly how your hair is in the reference picture, but mostly to see what is the main defining characteristic of your hair. So in my case, the main thing would be that it's pretty long and also that it's kind of wavy, but mostly that it's long. So just figure out what is the main characteristic of your hair, look at your picture, look at where your part is, look at what is the general outside shape of your hair, and then use that as a reference to draw the cartoon version of it. So if you're like me, you might have a lot of lines. I know I renamed this layer to clean sketch, but I realized it's definitely not a clean sketch. So you could go ahead and again, just either clean all your lines going in with the eraser, or just kind of going back in with the same strategy of lowering the opacity of this sketch, creating a new layer above it, and from there actually cleaning up everything. So we could go ahead and rename the layer with our character to character sketch, and then creating a new layer above that and renaming this layer to clean sketch. If you're kind of freaking out at this stage, that's totally okay, that's normal. There's a lot of lines, it looks really messy, and that can totally be overwhelming. But think of it as right now, all we have to do is go back and just trace what we want to use. So that's exactly what we're going to do on this clean sketch layer. By the way, you can hide your reference again, but going back on the clean sketch layer, but then all you have to do is go back on your clean sketch layer, and then pick from all the crazy lines you have which one you actually want to use and then trace that one. And I say clean sketch, but this is still not something we're going to see in the final result, so it doesn't need to be perfect line art, just a bit cleaner than what we had so far so that we know where to put the colors in the next step. So I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on cleaning up your sketch, and we're going to meet up in the next step, which is going to be the colors. So at this stage, we're essentially working with our own coloring book, which means the next few steps are going to be significantly easier than sketching everything. Now at this stage, I recommend you go ahead and hide your rough sketches and only work from your clean sketch. You could delete them if you want. That personally makes me nervous for some reason. So what I personally do in that case is create a group with all of my sketch layer and then just renaming that group to sketch. So that way my file remains organized, but I still have the rough sketch that I can go back to if I want to, for some reason, see the construction lines of everything, which can be helpful if you're trying to figure out why your composition is not working or why an element doesn't seem to kind of fit. Just going back to the construction line can be helpful for that, but I digress here, it doesn't matter. What does matter here is that you set your clean sketch layer to multiply so that we can see it really well no matter what we paint underneath. So at this stage, we're going to reactivate our reference layer, or reference image I should say, and we might need to put it above the sketch so we can see it really well, and we're going to use it to color pick different colors like the skin and the hair. Now you could totally go ahead and color pick like this, but as you can see, if you move your finger a little bit, the color changes quite a lot even if you're still color picking skin. So one trick you can use to avoid that is kind of blurring your image. So in Procreate, that would be in the adjustment panel, Gaussian blur, and you can just add a bit of blur. From there, it's going to be much easier. You can just color pick and the color is not going to drastically change if you move your finger a little bit. So you can just pick from any area that has skin and then go from there. That being said, just to be coherent with the color palette I'm providing, I'm going to go with this pink right here. Now for this illustration, I'm personally going to go with a more painterly style. So I'm only going to use one brush for all the colors, the shading, the details and everything. But you could go ahead and work with a few different brushes. If you want to have an illustration that is really solid, so without any texture, you could use in the airbrushing pack that comes with Procreate the hard brush or maybe even the medium brush. That could work really well. Otherwise, if you want a bit more texture, you could go again free brushes in the sketching pack that comes with Procreate using the 6B pencil, or you could experiment with the Willow charcoal brush from the charcoal pack. If you're working in a different software, it's pretty similar to Procreate in the sense that if you don't want any texture in your illustration, just pick a base round brush. But if you do want texture, try to find a brush that either has pencil or charcoal in the name and then experiment with that. If you have the illustration bundle, you have a few more options, so if you don't want any texture, I recommend using the base round brush. Otherwise, I'm personally going to be using the everything brush for the rest of the video. So we're going to start by just mapping out all the main color parts of the character and painting those on separate layers, starting with the skin. So we're just going to create a new layer, put it below the sketch, and rename it to skin. And from there you can just outline your different shapes and then fill them in with colors to create a bunch of silhouettes. And don't hesitate to lower the opacity of your sketch as well. That may help you see what you're doing a little bit more clearly. So once you have the skin, go ahead and do the same thing for the hair. So just a new layer, renaming this new layer to hair. And you can use the reference picture to color pick your color. Otherwise, again, just so I'm coherent with the color palette, I'm going to be using this brown right here. Now for the clothes, if you do see them in your picture and you want to use these colors as your clothes color in your illustration as well, you can totally go ahead and color pick that. Otherwise, just create a new layer, rename it, for example, to shirt, and then pick any color that you think could work. I know in my case I want mine to be gray, but in order to show you the example, I'm going to pick this blue right here, and then draw your silhouette with that color. Now once you have your silhouette, you can go ahead and use any color adjustment tool that you might have in your software. For example, in Procreate, if we go in the adjustment panel, we have hue, saturation, and brightness. And you can use this tool to explore different color options and build your palette more intuitively instead of needing to figure out our color palette before we start drawing. And there's really no right or wrong way to do this here, so just experiment until you find a color that you like for your shirt, and then repeat for the pants and any other elements you might have on your character. Now in my case, just so I'm coherent with the color palette, my shirt is going to be this gray right here, so I'm just going to drop that on top, and then move on to the pants and the socks. So take all the time you need here to color block the different elements of your character on separate layers. Feel free to pause the video, and then we're going to meet up for the next step. We're going to start adding color variation and details onto the character. Great, so before we move on to blocking out the colors from the background, we're just going to refine the colors that we have on the character a little bit. And what I mean by that is like adding the iris within the eyes, maybe a bit of red on the cheeks, maybe some color variation within the hair and stuff like that. Now to add color variation, we're essentially going to use the same technique, which is blocking the different colors onto separate layers, but we're going to apply those layers as clipping mask. So I'm going to show you an example with the skin. So I'm just going to create a new layer and rename it to cheeks, I guess. And then I'm going to tap on this layer, and from the menu I'm going to select clipping mask, which is going to add a little arrow next to my cheeks layer pointing down to the skin. And what that means is now everything we draw on the cheeks layer is going to stay within the skin shape. So we can go ahead and color pick our skin color, and then make it a little bit more pink, and just brush over the cheeks without having to worry about staying within the lines. Now, if clipping masks are not available to you in the software you use, it's really not a problem. You can still add some color variation. You just need to be a little bit more careful about staying within the shapes. You can use the same technique to add color variation within the hair. I really like to add a gradient in my hair, otherwise I feel like it's kind of long and boring. So again, just creating a new layer above whichever shape you want to add color variation on. Renaming it to whatever, I'm going to rename it to gradient, doesn't matter. Applying it as a clipping mask if it's available to you, and then color picking the main color. In my case, I'm going to make it kind of this burnt orange, and then brushing your color. So you could use this to add patterns on the shirt. In my example, I had patterns on the socks, so I could do that real quick. And you could also use kind of an alternate version of that technique to add the iris within the eyes. So just creating a new layer above the eyes, renaming it to iris, applying it as a clipping mask, and then picking whichever color you want to use for the eyes. I'm going to go with this green right here. And just quickly drawing the iris shape. Now the beauty of having the irises on a separate layer applied to a clipping mask is that you can very easily move them around. So let's say I use my arrow tool, I can just move the layer around to change the direction my character is looking in, so I don't have to erase or redraw everything. It's really super easy and very handy. So once more, feel free to pause the video here to add any color variation you want on your character, and then we're going to meet up in the next step. Before we start adding the details and the shading, we're going to color block the background as well. Before color blocking the background, you might want to go ahead and just group all of your character layers, because you probably have a lot by now. So to group layers, if you're working in Procreate, you just swipe them towards the right with one finger to select them all. And then you can just tap group at the top, collapse your group, and rename it to character. In terms of color blocking the background, you have a few different options. You could work on separate layers if you want, or you could go with more of a painterly style and just kind of paint all the colors at once. This is what I'm personally going to do here. If you're not super comfortable, it's totally okay. Just do like we did for the character and paint, for example, the blanket on one layer, the plant on one layer, the cushions on one layer, and stuff like that. And if you're not exactly sure which colors to use for your background, well, you kind of picked already most of the important colors from your piece by painting the characters. So what I recommend is just going back and color picking, for example, the hair, and saying, okay, this is the base core brown that I'm going to use, meaning this hue right here, what we usually call the color, which is actually the hue, I'm not going to change, but with that hue, I could get totally different variations. So something that is more orange, more of a beige, almost like a gray, and kind of playing within that, finding all the different browns that I need. So I know I need a brown for the wood of the window, so I'm just going to pick one there. I know I'm going to need a brown for the terracotta pots, so I'm going to pick one that is more orange. Same thing, I know I have the book that is blue, so I'm going to color pick that and pick. And then I have a few different variations that I can use for example, the cushions and stuff like that. If you're working in Procreate, there's also a very handy tool that you can use to build your color palette. Let's say I go back to the original kind of teal that I had. You can select Harmony here at the bottom, and it's going to pull up the color wheel, and within that color wheel, Procreate is automatically going to suggest a few colors that would work well with the one you have selected. So that's a really cool way of building your color palette. If you feel like what you had on your character is too limited, you could just select a color that is very intense. For example, mine, the book, is just so intense, and going from there, seeing what Procreate suggests you use. So this part of the video is going to be more of a draw with me. I'm going to have my video rolling while I paint my background, but I'm not going to give you more instructions. So if you're not a fan of that, you can skip straight to the next chapter of the video, which is going to be adding the details. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave a comment with whatever your character is going to be holding. And if you're new on the channel, you might be a bit confused right now with what is this secret password thing. It's a game that we play in all of my illustration videos. I hide a secret password for you guys to find, and people seem to like that little game. But the most important thing about it is that it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and paste my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you, so that's super important. So just leave a comment with whatever your character is holding, and then we're going to keep going. So now that we have everything mapped out, we can go ahead and start adding the details. And at this stage, you could totally add full-on outlines everywhere, like line art style if you want. But for this piece, again, since I'm going with something a bit more like towards the painterly style, I'm probably just going to add outlines or details whenever there's something I actually need to separate, like here the face. If I had the sketch, it just merged into the neck. There's no nose, no smile, no lashes and stuff like that. So this is personally how I'm going to add details in this piece. But again, if you want to have outlines everywhere, you can totally do that as well. And here I'm going to draw my details on 2 separate layers. I'm going to draw all the details that are for the character on a layer within the character group so that I can just then select the group and move the character around as needed. And then 1 layer with the details above the background. So I'm going to start with the details on the character to show you what I mean. So once more here, I'm going to stick with the everything brush, but if you're working with either a different software or free brushes, this is a point where you need more of a pencil brush as opposed to a charcoal if you were using the charcoal, because you need more precision. Now the way I like to add my details and outlines when I add outlines is just with darker versions of the different colors. You could go in with outlines that are all black, or otherwise, if you want to do like me, you just color pick your colors and then make them slightly darker. Once more, to be coherent with my color palette for the skin, the darker version I'm going to use is this one right here. And then pretty much just going any line that if the sketch isn't there, I can't see what's going on. For the eyelashes, I usually like to take a very dark version of my hair color. You can also add the highlights in your eyes on matte layers, so just picking pure white and then adding 2 dots. And there's really no right or wrong way to do this here, it's kind of a game of back and forth. So I recommend hiding your sketch, looking at what you just did, reactivating it, really doing that back and forth until you're happy with the details for your character. So once more, I'm going to stop talking, I'm going to keep my video going in the background so you can use it as a reference. And we're going to meet up once we have the details for the character. I'm going to give you a few tips for the details on the background. Now painting the details on your background is the exact same technique in the sense that we're going to create a new layer, but this time outside of the character group right above the background. We're going to rename it to details. And we're going to pick darker version at different colors and use that to draw the details. But I think for the background, at least for this painterly style, keeping your lines to the very bare minimum is probably your best bet, and trying instead to add more texture and patterns. So that would be my advice for drawing the details on your background. Focus mostly on adding details, textures, and patterns, and not so much on outlines per se. Otherwise, once more, take all the time you need to draw your different details in the background, and we're going to meet in the next step, the final one, probably one of the most important, shading. Great, so now that we have all the details, the last thing we have to do is bring this piece to life by adding some lights and some shadows. Now, if you have a window like me, we're going to start with that. So we're just going to create a new layer, and we're going to put this layer above the details that we have for the background, but below the character. And we're going to rename it to Window Lights. And for your lights, you can pick any color of your choice. I'm going to go with a nice bright yellow because I want my lights to be very warm, but you could experiment with different colors. And you're just going to color block the area over your window. Now I know right now it looks crazy, but we're going to set the blending mode of this layer to add. And we're going to apply some blur so that it looks like the window is glowing. So going back in the adjustment panel, if I can tap on it, selecting Gaussian blur and then adding as much or as little blur as you want. Now if it looks too bright, of course, you can go back and just lower the opacity of that layer until you get something that you're happy with. Now in terms of adding the lights onto the character and onto the backgrounds, you have a few different techniques. I personally like to use a technique that I call outlining your outline, which I think is really super easy and it really helps make the piece pop. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Otherwise you can add your highlights in any way you want, of course. So we're going to create a new layer right below our character details, so within the character group. We're going to rename this layer to lights, and we're going to use the same blending mode, so add. And we're going to lower the opacity probably around 20% or 30%, somewhere in that range for now, but we're going to play with it later to adjust everything once we have the shadows. And really all you have to do here is going with a fairly small brush. Again, I'm still with the same everything brush. You might be with a pencil brush or a hard brush. Really here, again, you can totally experiment. But what you would do here is literally just outlining the outlines that are facing the light source. Now here we have the window, so it's quite easy to see. So that means, for example, this side of the face right here is going to be outlined in light. Now you could also add some extra highlights. I like to add them, for example, on the cheeks and on the nose. But otherwise, very simple. Just any body part or any element that is facing the light source, so the window, you would just outline with light. So as you can see, it really doesn't take a long time because you don't have to be super precise, but already makes such a big difference. The piece looks so much more alive. Now you could go ahead and do the same thing and add highlights on all the background. I personally feel like it's a bit too much for this piece, but I'm going to add a few on the curtains because they're really in the lights. Otherwise, I'm not really going to add more highlights than that in the background. I'm mostly going to focus on the shadows. For the shadows, we're going to use a very similar technique, which means we're going to create a new layer. Again, we're going to start with the character. This new layer, we're going to put it below the details and below the lights. We're going to rename it to shadows. And here we're going to use the blending mode linear burn. Linear burn is not as strong as add, so for now you can set the opacity probably around, well, between 30 and 40%, and that range would work. And for your shadows, you can pick any color of your choice. Again, the only thing I would recommend is avoiding going with a neutral gray because then your shadows are going to be very muddy. In general, I like to go with shadows that are kind of purpley, blue, something in that range. And again, there are so many different ways you can add your shadows. I personally like to just focus on separating the different body parts or the different elements that still look too blended together. So it's not really as much about volume and being realistic. It's much more about, yeah, just making the different elements pop. So that would mean, for example, adding a shadow below the face on the neck to really accentuate that separation. Maybe one in this part of the hair. Something between the arms and the body. So you can see that it's super simple, but even just that really helps our character come to life. And right before we finish up with the background shadows, I recommend adding some sort of vignette effect to help frame your piece. So for that, you just create a new layer above everything that you have. Rename it to vignette. And with the same color you're using for your shadows, again, going back to linear burn, lowering the opacity for now around 30% or something like that. You're going to darken either all of the corners, so all 4 of them, or if your light source is kind of touching one of the corners, all the corners except that light source. In my case, I have these 3 corners here. And then you can go back and blur that in, so using, again, our trusty Gaussian blur from the adjustment panel. and adding some blur to create more of a gradient as opposed to a solid shape. And of course, you can go back and play with the opacity of your vignette as much as you want. So last but not least, we're going to add some shadows on the background as well. So just creating a new layer below the details, below the lights. And at this point, honestly, if you want, you can also group all of the background layers in one big background group. That might be a good idea. And then just creating a new shadow layer for your background. Setting the blending mode to linear burn, and once more lowering the opacity between 30 and 40% for now. And here the tip I have for you is to focus on your cast shadows. So what I mean by that is locating your light source. In my case, it's this window right here, obviously. And then following the light, seeing where the light hits an object, right behind that object or that character or whatever, adding a shadow there. So in my case here, I have the character, so I'm going to have a shadow behind my character like this. Behind the feet, behind the cushion. All of this bottom section is going to be shaded as well. Part of the floor. You get the point. Once you've painted all your shadows and all your lights, you can go back and play with the opacity of the different layers to just rework your contrast a little bit. And if you want, you could also experiment with putting your background shadows above your background details. That might be something you prefer. I think that's something I'm personally going to go with, but again, you can totally experiment and see which version you like the most. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn how to draw more cartoon versions of yourself, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more tutorials for you. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos I post every Tuesday and Saturday. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.